Hey, welcome to Season 6 of the Two Text Podcast. I'm here with my co-host, David Harvey, and my name is John Andrews. Yeah. So this is a podcast of two friends from two different countries meeting every 2 weeks to talk about the Bible. Each week we pick one text to talk about, which invariably leads to us talking about two texts and often many more. Now this season we're exploring Jesus' I am sayings in John's Gospel and how they draw us into a bigger vision of who Jesus is.
Well, John, in our last episode, we were talking about this long section in John chapter 8, which begins with Jesus saying, I am the light of the world. And then you get this sense that because Jesus is the light, those who are not in the light, those who are pushing away from Jesus, they find themselves in darkness. And we talked about how that connects with chapter 1, and we see this theme consistently. And then the whole narrative of chapter 8 journeys along until you get this you use this phrase, soft I am statement, which I really like that. It's not an I am the light of the world, it's just an I am. But perhaps the most revolutionary of the I ams on their own in John 8:58, before Abraham was, I am. And the people decide they're going to stone Jesus as a result of this, but Jesus is hidden from them, which you then beautifully drew in just as we landed the episode, that we see exactly the same thing happen in chapter 12. That Jesus is talking about light, talking about walking in the light, and then if people choose not to go with Jesus, they can't find him, he's hidden again. And I wondered if, just to jump back in, that we didn't want last episode to just keep getting longer and longer and longer. So let's start where we ended. It would be fun to read from John 8:58 right through into John 9:5, right? And reminding, we say this all the time, but reminding ourselves that when John wrote this, the chapters and the verses weren't in there. So this is a single flow of the narrative. But remembering that we're in a conversation about Jesus saying, I am the light of the world, at John 8:12, I want to suggest that maybe John, when he was writing this gospel, intends you to read at very least right the way through to 9 verse 5, but in truth, probably longer. But I wonder if it's worth just reading that quickly, John. Is that okay?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I would totally concur. I think, in fact, if you go all the way to the end of chapter 9, we're sort of getting into the blindness and sight conversation again. It's quite, and that's to do with the religious leaders again. Yes. And then as you move into chapter 10, where you got the Good Shepherd conversation, has that got to do with spiritual blindness? I mean, it's just, I think the whole thing, John's magnificent. He's creating a stream of incredible narrative here, or really teaching discourse, which just gets us hooked. And if we didn't have the chapters and verse divisions, we'd just be, wait, where do I actually stop here? Because it keeps going. So chapter 8, verse 58, Jesus says these incredible words, very truly, I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. At this they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world.
I mean, it wraps right the way round, doesn't it? It's
totally does. And again, it's a great example for our listeners, if they're not already aware of it, that sometimes, we've said this many, many times without any criticism whatsoever of wonderful translators, but sometimes the chapter headings and chapter divisions and headings just come at slightly the wrong place. And I think if you ran from 8 straight into 9 on this, though it makes it a super long chapter, and I understand that's difficult, actually it makes total sense. The whole thing's connected magnificently.
Yeah, and yes, I mean 100%. I mean, my goodness, would we do a better job if we were translators putting chapters in? No, we would not. And for convenience, I mean, thank goodness that they're there because
Yeah,
I mean, I've looked at some of the early scrolls that didn't have chapters or verses or even spaces in them,
true.
and it is not an easy process. So
It's
I think it's helpful. People don't hear what we're not saying.
true.
There's nothing wrong with the chapters or the verses, but it's worth us remembering
Yeah.
they're there as a convenience to help us find text. They're not necessarily always the break in the narrative, are they? And this is a classic example of that. The way that Jesus speaks here, and you read that so well. But this happens so that the works of God might be, and the word is essentially, it says displayed here, but it's kind of almost revealed, made known. There's an illuminated sort of sense of this here.
Yeah.
And like you say, that the whole narrative is developing from seeing to being able to hear. And you get this second double down of, I am the light of the world. Now, it's slightly different language in the Greek here, so it's technically not an I am statement.
Yes.
He doesn't use the emphatic, but it wraps a nice, at least it's part of the bow.
It's an echo.
Yes, of what Jesus is saying here, that you've got, a statement about light, a statement about seeing, a statement about understanding Christ, and then we bump into a blind man. And of course, what's stunning about this blind man is that he can't see. I mean, my goodness, I get so excited about John chapter 9, so I'm going to have to restrain myself. You just push mute, John, at some point and stop me from talking. But I think the man born blind is a classic example of everything John's gospel is talking to us about the revelation of Christ, right? Because if you actually, and I encourage listeners to do this, go and read the story. The man meets Jesus, but their meeting essentially amounts to Jesus spits in the ground, puts mud on his eyes, and says, go wash in the pool, and drumroll, the pool called sent, right? So I was sent by the Father, remember way back in 8:12, right?
Yeah.
Now this man is sent, and the man went, washed, and came home seeing, right? Early church commentators picked up on this as a kind of baptismal scene as well, that this man is now. But that's his entire encounter with Jesus. But every time somebody talks to this man, and we don't see Jesus again for the rest of the, for like a lot of verses, Jesus disappears.
The end of the chapter.
Every time somebody talks to this man, every single time there's a progression of conversations, the man seems to have learned something about Jesus. But at no point has he had any further contact with Jesus, yet somehow he's just spitting truth, right? It's just coming out of him, leading up to him eventually calling himself a disciple. He says to the Pharisees, do you also want to become his disciples? And you're like, well, when did this man become Jesus' disciple? And then it's really fascinating that he then circles back and actually does meet Jesus. And it's very apparent at the point that he's face to face with Jesus, he doesn't know who it is because his entire spiritual renewal has happened because of the light of Christ in him, not based on his ability to recognize Jesus, the man. And the story is a parable of everything that's happening in chapter 8. I mean, I said it as fast as I could to try and not take over the whole podcast.
No, it's brilliant. It's absolutely correct. And I mean, I think the interaction between the man and the religious leaders is amongst the funniest in the whole of the Gospels. That lovely climactic moment where he says, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. No one has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And you get this, it's almost like he's worked it out. Now, as you said, magnificent moment that his eyes are opened. He's somewhere in this conversation has become a disciple of Jesus. He's speaking like a disciple, but he's also, with his eyes opening, he's recognized something. And it's not just because he can see again. He's actually speaking words that make sense about Jesus. And here he is defending Jesus phenomenally well in front of expert debaters and arguers, to the point where all they can resort to is an insult.
Yes.
I mean, his argument is so good in terms of verses 30, 31, 32. Their only response is, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Right? So you know that you're arguing well when experts who can argue in law in the finer points of the law and the text have no answer to your argument and actually have to boot you out because you've got so under their skin. So the progression of the conversation between this man and the religious community is really worth our listeners sitting down and having a slow read of that, because it's sort of funny, but it's also brilliant. And again, David, just to finish this wee point on, that leads then, we come full circle right at the end of chapter 9 with this spiritual blindness conversation again. Yes. Because Jesus heard he's thrown out. Jesus has the conversation with him. And the man says, Jesus says to him, "You have now seen him, the one who's healed you, the Son of Man. He is the one speaking with you." Then the man says, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. And then Jesus says these incredible words, which then get him into trouble again with the religious leaders. "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." And then the Pharisees can't resist it. They go, the Pharisees who were with him heard him say this, says, "What, are we blind too?" And Jesus said, "Well, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim that you can see, your guilt remains." So we've got this incredible, this whole, from John chapter 8, verse 12, we've now come full circle all the way round to John chapter 9, verse 41. And the whole thing's being completed by this magnificent miracle of the blind man right in the middle of all of that. It's like it becomes the practical demonstration of what darkness looks like, what light looks like, and what the manifestation of the glory of God looks like when we recognize it.
It's so good. It's quite stunning, actually, the levels to which. I mean, I'm trying not to turn this into a session on John chapter 9 now accidentally, but the whole, I mean, everything you've said, yes, and amen. And I almost tentatively, just trying to practice my own restraint, want to then avoid John 9, but then open another can of worms, because the lead up to John chapter 8 and Jesus saying, "I am the light of the world," is not insignificant either, is it? So just to kind of build our jigsaw piece, we have "I am the light of the world" in the middle. It branches out into everything we've just said about this John 9 that, is, I mean, my goodness, like, how can you not see that it's clearly connected? Yeah. But of course, all this happened coming from Jesus being at the Feast of Tabernacles, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it should be worthwhile noting that I suppose chapter 7 and 8 all happens in the temple precinct, and then of course remember at the end of 8 he's hidden from them and he moves out, and then he meets the blind man somewhere, we assume outside the temple precinct. So 7 and 8 are in the temple, and it leads to a dramatic, and here's a gorgeous thought for us potentially, a dramatic revelation of light outside the temple. So you get this idea that Jesus is the light of the world. He's declared that inside the temple. And there's reasons for that, which we'll come back to. But the demonstration that he's the light of the world is outside the temple. And actually, it's with a man born blind, we assume, congregating somewhere outside the temple precinct, and I think that shouldn't be lost on that sense of movement that we're feeling here. But of course, in the feast of the celebrating the tabernacles, one of the things that they did, of course, was celebrate the light that guided the people of God through the wilderness, the pillar of fire that came to them at night, the luminous cloud that gathered them in the day. And there was a lovely, interesting, I mean, this is way back in our previous podcast, but I don't know if our listeners will remember this, but there was a lovely little allusion to something that in the reading, which was quite striking. when Jesus speaks of himself as the light of the world in John chapter 8, it goes on to say these words, verse 20. So we've got, I'm the light of the world, verse 12. In verse 20, it says, he spoke these words while teaching in the temple courts near the place where the offerings were put. Now, that's a bit of a, you sort of think, well, so what? Well, the place where the offerings were put was in the court of the women. Now, don't be misled by that, listeners. Court of the women doesn't just mean a court for women. It really, you might want to describe it as a family court, a court where women and men and others, children could meet. So it's not exclusively for women, but it allows women to go somewhere, as opposed to the court of the men and eventually the court of the priests. So you've got an area. But what's striking in that area is not only were the great offering receptacles sort of there, but you also had 4 dynamic candelabras or lamps that were in that court. In fact, there's somewhere in the region of 75 foot high, according to research that we have. And these things, during the Feast of Tabernacles, were lit every night, filled with blocks of wood and oil, and they were set alight. Now, just imagine the scene, David. We've got the temple at the highest part of the city, and the court of the women is steps down from the whole the holy of holies, the holy place. So you've got an elevated site now suddenly being lit up by these incredible 4 massive lamps that are being set ablaze to celebrate the cloud and the fire in the wilderness, all part of the tabernacles, these tents that the people lived in. And it's in that context that Jesus is declaring himself to be the light of the world. So when he says, I am the light of the world, he's saying it in the very section of the temple where they lit these 4 lamps, huge lamps, that commentators and scholars have referred to, that when they were lit, they literally lit up the whole of the skyline over Jerusalem. It was this whole thing just came to life. And Jesus is declaring that there. And of course, the image of the cloud and the fire, and how the New Testament refers to the cloud and the fire, and Jesus picking up that idea as the light of the world, as the one who guided his people through the wilderness, as the one who directed them and helped them in the darkness and in their wanderings. Jesus is picking that up again as he declares he's the light of the world. So I think you get a trajectory. You've got Jesus declaring himself to be the light of the world in the context of the Feast of Tabernacles, in the one place where the great big lamps were lit. And then he's that light is not just remaining in the temple, but that light is now moving outside the temple, because those within the temple, have they rejected that light? Are they refusing to see that light? Is it hidden from them? All that language. But the first person to see that light after Jesus declares it in terms of moving out of the temple, not within it, after Jesus declares it moving out of the temple, is a man born blind who sees the light of the world. And I think that whole flow is dynamically powerful and something that we're meant to see in its fuller context as we move along. Hope some of that made sense in terms of chapter 7, which rolls into chapter 8.
I mean, my goodness, it's fascinating, John. And I think, I want to say something carefully, because of our modern context, but I don't think we should not say these things just because of where things are at in the contemporary era. John's gospel is clearly being written evidencing some very difficult tensions between the Jewish authorities and Christians, right? Like most scholars, right? The time that John's writing, there's tension here. And I think you see that come out in John's writing. Now, of course, there's been accusations, therefore, that John is an anti-Semitic text. And I think that's deeply unfair, because that's that's adding modern concerns of horrendous things that have happened to the people of Israel and kind of porting them back onto John, and even taking modern interpreters who have done bad things with John. But if we can be mature enough almost to push that to one side for a second and say, let's not get caught up in those concerns and read the text with a Jewish writer like John writing about a tension between Christians and Jewish ruling people.
Yeah.
So this then allows us to say a couple of things I think which are key. We've alluded to this already, that the I am statements often seem to be things said in contrast to what people at the time of Jesus believed were true of the Torah, of the law, of the religious traditions of the era. So it's interesting that the Feast of Tabernacles is the feast of tents and of the people moving in the wilderness and God guiding them. But now it's being celebrated in a temple, right? Which even in the Old Testament, there's a tension over that does God really want a house, right? So when you were saying all that, it struck me that just really simply, I am the light of the world, Jesus says in John 8:12. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness.
Yeah.
There's movement image, which is absolutely perfect. I mean, it's hard to hear that and not think of the tabernacles, right?
Yeah.
Of not think of the people of Israel following the light. So Jesus, can I put words in Jesus's mouth? Dangerous, I realize. Jesus is like, we're here at this festival, remembering God guiding us on a walk through the desert by his light. I am his light, and whoever walks after me will not walk in the darkness but in light, right? But then, and I think you're absolutely right to point this out. He spoke these words in the temple courts. He spoke these words in the fixed place where we no longer follow God around through the desert, but we're fixed here, right? Then, to your point that you then made in verse 59, at this, they picked up stones, but Jesus himself slipped away from the temple courts. So Jesus is, can I again put more words in the text, walking away from the temple space, right? I am the light of the world, not this building. I am the light of the world. And he slips out of the temple courts and immediately meets someone who now follows him and does not any longer walk in darkness. And just to really emphasize it, that man is blind.
Yes.
And then, of course, you get the whole exchange. And I realize I'm just stitching together what you're saying, but it's interesting how you even get this, and this is why I wanted to prefix it this way. There is this walk away from the temple that's happening. That it is Jesus is light of the world, not the temple. Jesus is the light of the world, not the religious traditions or the Torah or that. And John metaphorically visualizes that for us because Jesus starts this statement in the temple, walks away from the temple, and somebody does follow him. But it's not the Pharisees. And like I say, I'm desperately careful. I don't want people to accuse us of sort of reading this in an anti-Jewish way. But I think it's hard not to see that John is trying to show some form of temple displacement, at very least, happening here in this. And John can't envisage what people will go and do with this, but I think that's what's happening. We're seeing physically the departure in this particular text.
Yeah, and it does line up. And again, we have to do it with care. And I think you've if people are going to listen to us properly, you've positioned that brilliantly in the sense that our hearts are not to in any way offend or wound or hurt or be accused of anything untoward that's not in line with what following Jesus looks like. But this is in line with John, and earlier on in John's gospel, John quotes Jesus when Jesus clears out the temple in chapter 2. Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will rebuild it." Now, that ends up becoming a controversial statement in his own trial, because it's misunderstood. But of course, you do get this incredible idea that John is presenting Jesus as the one not only coming to the temple, but in many ways he is the temple, or if you like, the original idea the original idea was not a fixed building. The original idea was, God's idea was the tent. You could argue that although God endorsed temple, you could argue that temple was a human idea that the Lord still blessed. But his idea, God's idea, was tent. God's idea was something that would move. God's idea was something that could sit in the midst of a people who were moving in one respect. So I think when you think about tabernacle rather than temple, you think movement. You are thinking movement. When you think tabernacle, not temple, you're not just thinking of the movement of people, you're thinking of the movement of God with people, God in people, a moving God, if you like, who's not fixed to one postcode or one address, but he is moving to us, he's moving with us, he's moving in us. And so we get those ideas presented. I think they're unmissable ideas in the tabernacle, the original tabernacle. I think then that's what Jesus is representing. It's not that he's come to destroy a temple. He's not going to do that. That someone else will do that years hence. But actually he's come to show, I've come to show you that the God who moved among you, the God who lived among you, the God who walked with you, the God who moves with you and you move with him, he's here. He's here right now. So I think that language is already at play in John's gospel. Yes. And of course we see it here in the trajectory out of the temple courts, the very place where the great lamps were lit, out of the court of the women, and then the trajectory is towards something that if we don't quite track it, we miss this, that this great miracle of the healing of the blind man takes place outside of the temple, showing that the temple, Jesus, has moved. The light of the world, the great light of the temple ultimately, apart from festivals, was the menorah, right? The great image of the tree of life lit up. That was a perpetual light in both tabernacle and temple. Jesus is this light. He's this moving light now, and he's this great light moving out of the temple and moving into the world. And again, I think that speaks to us that actually his light in us was never meant to be fixed, but always meant to be moving towards darkness and moving to darkness and moving to those in darkness.
Now, throw something else in here, which I'm kind of out on a ragged edge here, John, because this is new to me. But I'm curious if you've stumbled over this, and if not, might be something we need to come back to. So again, hold everything you've just said in mind, because I agree completely. When Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of the life. So, temple, celebrating the tabernacles, following God through the darkness, having light. The Pharisees challenged him and said, here you are appearing as your own witness. Your testimony is not valid, right? And I'm fascinated by this, right? But in the Septuagint, there's a reference, the way that the tabernacle is referred to in a couple of places. In Hebrew is the tabernacle of the covenant law, right? Yeah. But in the Greek translation, they refer to it as the tabernacle of witnesses. It's exactly the same word. In fact, and in Acts 7, they refer to it. They say our ancestors had the tabernacle of witnesses with them in the wilderness. It was made according to God's pattern. And it just struck me as fascinating that in this conversation about the festival that is about God's guidance, Jesus talks about, no, I'm going to guide you. You're going to follow me into the light. And the question of witnessing comes back up again. It feels like, knowing John as we do, he's meshing together more ideas than we're even instantly aware of. But I have to admit, I don't know much about this reference of the tabernacle of witnesses. I'm not sure if you've encountered that. You're nodding, so I'm wondering if you have.
Yes, I've sort of heard it and referenced it, but I've never really thought about it in this context, actually. And I sure said, wow, that's an amazing possible connection. Again, it wouldn't. again, without us both standing out on a limb together, that wouldn't shock me. But that wouldn't shock me if the New Testament writers and those who are fluent and understand both the Hebrew Bible and the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, are aware of this language and what's at play, then and certainly by the time John comes to write, he's got both of those under his belt. Then you get this incredible sense that actually even more is being nuanced in these references, that this is not just random behavior or random language, but this is in fact something that's reflecting this witness of the tabernacle, the witness of what God wants to and always wanted to establish by presencing himself within this tent and among his people, that he would be their light, and that he and through him, they would be his light. Sorry, I got all my language muddled up there. He would be their light, and then through him, they would be his light to the world. I mean, this was, and I think that picks up then the language of when Jesus speaks to his followers, you are the light of the world. I think this is this exact idea then being carried through again and connected to what's already a resident Old Testament idea, Tanakh idea.
It struck me as interesting that the tent is the sort of portable presence of God, and here it was, and the light of the cloud and the fire in the desert were witnesses to God being present to them.
Yeah.
And so, like, how do we know God's with us in the desert? Well, look at the pillar of fire at night, pillar of cloud by day. And it's almost as if Jesus is saying, well, how do you know? His answer to how do you know God is with you? His answer is, well, I'm here. That I'd say I am witnessing, and the Father is witnessing, that me being here witnesses to God being with us, and therefore follow me, and you will never walk in darkness again.
So that's it for this episode. Now, we know there's always more to explore, and we encourage you to dive into the text and do that. If you like this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you rated it, reviewed, or shared it. We also appreciate all our listeners who financially support the show, sharing the weight of producing the podcast. If you'd like to support us, visit tutex.com. But that's all for now. So until next time, from David and I, it's goodbye.